how much debt relief to grant to Greece. And a group of academics, of which here we have a distinguished delegation, has put forward a very thoughtful, I think, and very coherent proposal, which spans both economics and the law, which, as we know, is very important because some of the arguments we hear against debt relief are legal as opposed to economic. So, yes, here we have 3 speakers who are part of that group, which will present various aspects of the proposal. Each of them will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions, and we'll do our best to finish on time so that we can try and have some lunch, or at the very least, join the next session in the conference. So we'll start with Richard Portes, who will talk for 10 minutes max, and I'll be a strict enforcer of this timing. And then we'll move on to the next 2 speakers. Richard.
Don't start your clock until I get my slides up. Which one? Portes. Portes, Greek debt, whichever one works best. Yeah, there we go. Very good. Okay. Here are all the authors. And indeed, it was an independent report. Although we have Do I need the mic? Okay, if you like. Fine. We want to try to be realistic. The Troika, all members of the Troika, and most recently the European Central Bank, have called for strong debt relief. Well, what's strong? Is it just more, extend, and pretend? We don't think that would be adequate. That would be unrealistic. The government is quite clear. It wants a clean break from the program, and it doesn't want any significant conditionality. It wants to be able to claim a political achievement in return for all that austerity before they go into the next elections. The Bank of Greece, on the other hand, is worried that any old shock might bring down the whole construct by spooking the markets, and they therefore want a precautionary credit line of some sort or another. The government is opposed to that. The 88 prior actions that still have to be completed, well, some of them, since I wrote that, have been completed, but there's still a lot to do before Greece can be deemed to be exiting the program. Some questions, which, there we go. Oh, sorry. Right. First, they have a 20 billion euro cash buffer. Would that be sufficient to guard against shocks and alleviate the concerns of the Bank of Greece? There is an issue about whether face value debt relief is permissible under Article 125, and our distinguished legal colleague will deal with that in a little while. It's important to recognize that because of the payment profile now of the Greek debt having been rescheduled, reprofiled, the private sector debt, private sector creditors, new private sector creditors, as long as they don't buy into long debt, if they buy into 5-year or less debt, they will de facto be senior, and the markets realize that. We asked ourselves how to devise an incentive structure that might work in the case of significant face value debt reduction, and we considered a number of options. Jeremy will go into those in detail. Finally, I think you should be aware, many of you are perhaps, of the current state of play in the Greek economy. There has been some improvement. They are running a very substantial primary surplus. What is it now, German? 3.5, 4? Yeah, something like that, which is pretty substantial. And GDP growth, there is some, finally. It's perceptible. And unemployment is falling perceptibly. There's no doubt that that exports, the volume of exports is up very significantly, and there has been a shift in the structure of the economy towards the tradable sector, which was absolutely essential. So the flows look good, right? The stocks don't look good at all. The debt to GDP ratio is, I don't know what it is now. It's hard to keep up, but it's about 180%, I think. And the level of unemployment, although it's falling, it's still 20% plus. The share of that in long-term unemployed is very distressing. It's over 50%. And of course, there has been a lot of immigration in response to that. And the immigration typically is of the best and the brightest. And that is not good for the future, unless this process can be reversed. And that we hope might be one of the results of following the option that we ultimately recommend. The non-performing loans, again, depends on how you classify them, but they're at least 40% of the total loans outstanding of the Greek banks. The bank capital, it looks good, and the stress tests, they've been through the stress tests, it's wonderful. But if you look at the capital structure closely, you discover that 2/3 of it, of common equity tier 1 capital, is deferred tax assets. Well, that is not what I think you would regard as being very useful in times of stress. So these are all serious problems, and we are only tackling the debt problem, but it's a significant part of it. And finally, the environment. You know, there is, not surprisingly, huge reform fatigue, huge fatigue with the results of austerity, and more pension cuts to come. I can give you all sorts of anecdotes. It's been very, very painful. And that means that there will be a danger of reversal if they leave the program. Opinions differ as to what that danger is and how serious it might be. Poverty is widespread. And most importantly, from the point of view of an economist, you can't run a modern market economy, or even a not so modern market economy, with a judicial and administrative system that simply does not function. You can't enforce bankruptcy, you can't seize collateral, and so on and so on. This cannot continue. So these are things they have to do regardless of whether they are in another program or some kind of conditionality or not.
I was saying you had 5 more minutes, but you've been incredibly sparing in time, so we'll now have Jeremy Zettelmeier of the... Fantastic, who will guide us through the... He's got the, yes, all the numerical work which is in the report.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try and take you through the report in 10 minutes, maybe eating in into a few minutes that Richard did not use. So by the way, if you want to look this up, there are actually 2 papers. So the CEPR report is this one, is sort of longer and in a more academic style, and then there's also a shorter version, which is this PIE policy brief, and I'm actually going to be a bit closer in the presentation to the PIE policy brief version than to the main report. So, in case you need to go for lunch, basically what you need to know about the report is on this slide. Okay, so these are our main claims. The first claim is uncontroversial. So the European Commission, the ESM, the ECB, everyone agrees with the first claim that even under optimistic assumptions about future growth and fiscal performance, Greece's public debt as it stands today is unsustainable. Okay, This is our main and controversial claim. So what we do in this report is we look at whether the types of measures that the Eurogroup has not proposed but promised to consider, whether they would be enough to make the Greek debt sustainable. And the answer is they might, but only under very optimistic assumptions, particularly about fiscal performance, right? So there's a particular threshold that you need to meet on the primary surplus path. Once you fall below that, the whole thing collapses. And as a result, we argue in the report that you will need to do more, and we sort of place with several options. And here I'm summarizing them in just two. So you could try and do the sort of measures that the Eurogroup is considering, which is, not to do anything on face value in particular, but you can try and extend them to a broader set of debts. So what the Eurogroup has in mind is the EFSF, which is the bulk, but not all, of official credits. So this was the vehicle for financing Greek in the first and the second programs. So you can extend it beyond the EFSF to the Greek loan facility, which was used for the first program, or you can apply to the ESM, or you could have the ESM continue to finance Greece, which is sort of equivalent in some sense to having the ESM restructure its own debts. So if you try this, it may just work, but at a pretty high price, which I'm going to show you in a second, which is that you will have increasing exposure of the official sector to Greece over a long time. And then you need a long time to work your way down from that. And so the implication is that Greece would still be repaying to the European creditors probably well into the 21st century. Okay? So, this is extraordinary, right? Because we all believe that we all understand that the 2010 crisis was a very traumatic event, but the notion that this will perhaps have to be repaid by like 2 generations removed from the crisis is absurd to me. And so that's why we basically end up with a second option, which is you're going to have to cross that red line and forgive some of the face values. And so the main contribution of the report is to come up with an idea of how you can do this in a conditional way that would be good for incentives, that would incentivize Greece to do better fiscal performance than it would otherwise do, and as a result might pass the test of Article 125, which is going to be Miguel's argument. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few pictures now and then conclude. So this picture you probably know. This is the composition of Greek general government debt right now, and the main point to take away is that the blue-greenish is debt owed to official creditors, and the rest is T-bills and debt owed to the Bank of Greece and to private creditors. And so this is more than 75%, right? So this is what is really the bulk, and this is why we're talking about an official restructuring, not a private restructuring right now. Okay, this is an important picture. So this gives you the planned debt service based on Greece's current commitments. And so this includes everything, including T-bills. And what you see here is that basically in roughly the first 10 years, from 2019 to roughly 2029 or something like that, Greece is going to have to finance debt service in excess of 10% of GDP. Now that number is a bit exaggerated by the fact that this includes T-bills, which can be rolled over, right? So you don't have to go to the market for everything, but the T-bill stock right now is very high. It's about 15 billion, and the intention is to actually shrink that. So you cannot fully roll it over. You can maybe roll over 2/3. And so if you take that into account, these would still be numbers in the order of 10% of GDP, at least for the first few years. And so that you do have to refinance from the market. And this is the fundamental reason why Greece has a sustainability problem, right? So the argument that's always made is that it is wrong in the case of Greece to focus too much on the debt to GDP ratio, right, which is off the charts, something like 185% debt to GDP, because most of this is concessional debt at very low interest rates. The problem, however, is that as you start repaying these debts here without having new access to official funding, you're going back to the market. And then you are step by step replacing this highly concessional debt with expensive market debt. And that's what leads to explosive debt dynamics. So this is what the next chart shows. So this is essentially the same. So this blue stuff here is the financing needs associated with the current debt. So basically, this profile here, if you like, is here. And then, in order to, refinance this debt service that's coming due, you're going to have to immediately start borrowing from the market. Now, in this kind of counterfactual exercise, what we have done is assumed that the average maturity of borrowing from the market is about 5 years. So then you see, after about 5 years, this orange stuff, which is initial amortizations of new market debt coming due, and what you also see is increasing interest service on this debt borrowed from the market. And eventually, this overwhelms the debt dynamics and the gross financing needs explode. Okay, so the question is, can you fix this problem through the strategy of extending maturities and linking debt service to GDP? So what you're doing by doing that is you are acting on a small portion of this debt, namely the portion that is owed to the EFSF and to some extent the IMF, because the IMF would be repaid early. And the question is whether by doing this you can lower the initial gross financing requirements enough that you need to borrow less from the market, and so you avoid this explosive debt dynamics, right? And so basically the answer, as I'll show you in a second, is very sensitive to the medium and long-term fiscal assumptions that you make. And so this compares sort of what is out there. So the IMF, as you well know, for a long time has argued that Greece could never deliver more than 1.5%. Now, they were obviously wrong. They've delivered 3.7 2 years in a row. But as a long-term statement, the IMF is standing by its assessment. So everyone agrees that, we can probably deliver the 3.5 for a few more years, but then what will happen after that? So the IMF predicts you go down like a stone to 1.5 after this post-program period has ended. The European Commission has three scenarios, which actually I can right. Okay, sorry. The blue IMF thing is hidden by this gray curve here. Okay, sorry. This is the IMF, and then it gets hidden by the gray curve, which is the scenario C of the European Commission. Okay, the two European Commission scenarios that they view as their central scenarios and as a pessimistic but not too pessimistic scenario is this ECA and ECB. And here the idea is that you hold the 3.5 for a while, and then you come down to either something like 2.25, or you come down to 2, and then you hold this forever. Okay, and so in a paper that actually two papers that different sets of co-authors of our team wrote, we basically argued that this is historically unprecedented, not only for Greece, but for any country. And so a more realistic path is to think that maybe they can come down a bit more slowly than the IMF assumes, but come down they will, right? And so this is sort of our preferred scenario where, they say at 3.5, they come down, maybe they hold 1.5 for a while, eventually they go further down, right? So these are more realistic scenarios. Okay, now I'll show you how these different scenarios impact the debt dynamics. So I'm going to do that for two things, for the status quo and for the full set of Eurogroup measures which we have assumed will be implemented in a particular way that tries to stay really close to the spirit and letter of what the Eurogroup has announced. And so I'm focusing on two things. So this primary surplus scenario is the idea that you're going to maintain it at 2% at least. So this is the EC scenario B. And then there's this scenario that the primary surplus will gradually decline to 1%, which is this turquoise line here. Okay, so under the status quo, everyone agrees that debt is not sustainable. So I'm using this same criterion. This is essentially the same picture that I showed you before. So this is the gross financing needs of Greece, except that this is done in a stochastic debt sustainability framework. So there's the fan chart around this. And this kind of bumpiness has to do with the maturity structure of this private debt that we are assuming. And the red lines are sort of the boundaries of sustainability that the Eurogroup has agreed on, right? This comes from the IMF's debt sustainability methodology, but the Eurogroup has officially endorsed this. And so the idea is that, you know, in the long run, you definitely don't want to go beyond 20%. Okay, that's the absolute maximum that you want to do. And you can see that even with this optimistic fiscal assumptions, this is easily violated. And if you, on top of that, you assume that the primary surplus gradually declines to 1%, it's even worse. Now, this side here is the really interesting side. So the point here is that basically we kind of find that, yes, you know, the Eurogroup and the European Commission that does the calculations, they are indeed intellectually honest, because it so happens that under their scenarios A and B, full application of the Eurogroup measures, as we interpret them, could make the debt sustainable. So you look, if you compare these two charts, right? So it has a drastic impact on the debt dynamics, and this would stay in the long run between 15 and 20%, and the debt ratio would come down slowly, but it would come down. But the point is that this is totally not robust to slightly more pessimistic fiscal assumptions. And so if you go from this path, so this is the green path, is the one that produces this chart. If you go from this green path to the turquoise path, where it continues going down, it has a really drastic effect, and this is not sustainable. Okay, so that's the main message. So what do you do? So one approach, as I said, is you could try and sort of turbo boost the Eurogroup's approach, either in the cross-sectional dimension by including extra facilities under this approach, or by, Lucas? Yes. So it was hidden in this thing. So in these pictures, we assume 3% nominal, which you can rationalize as 1% potential, 2% inflation. There's a long discussion in the paper why we assume the 1% potential. Everyone thinks it sounds low for a country that has to catch up. The reason is demographics, okay? So you have basically, you can assume fairly generous assumptions on catch-up growth. It is very, very difficult to get above 1% given the demographics. That's the reason. But this said, the main claim here that under this fiscal assumption, full use of the Eurogroup measures are not going to make the debt sustainable is robust to assuming the higher growth that the European Commission prefers to assume, which is 1.25. Right? In their scenario B, they also assume 1. Scenario A, they assume 1.25. Okay, so the very basic point is you can sort of you can have this approach on steroids, you know, even longer interest deferrals, or, you know, maturity extensions applied to even bigger debt categories. And, you know, what you get then is this kind of a chart for, here this is an example where you backload EFSF and ESM amortizations and GLF. Everything gets pushed to the back. And then you allow interest deferrals. Interest deferrals basically means it's like fresh lending, right? Because you are rolling interest into principal. It's like lending Greece the money to repay its principal. And so the very unpleasant implication of that is that if you did this, and so this is a scenario which barely might make debt sustainable. The consequences is you go from about 250 billion total outstanding of the European official sector to Greece to a peak of about 400 in 2037. And the peak is in 2037 because we have assumed that the maximum deferral is 15 years, right, after the end of the post-program period. And then, of course, since you have this enormous peak, it takes forever to repay. Okay, so what's the alternative? It's conditional face value debt relief. And so this is my last slide, and then there will be a conclusion, but I can skip that. So basically, the essence of the idea is the following. Define two primary surplus paths, a lower one and an upper one. The way you want to pick these paths is as follows. The upper path is a path that Greece should reasonably be able to achieve and should have the incentives to achieve simply because it doesn't want to default without getting a big carrot. So in our example, we have taken the IMF's 1.5% to be that path. The upper path is a path that Greece could potentially achieve, but only with a carrot. Okay, so for the purpose of example, we have taken the 2% that the Eurogroup wants as a minimum to be that upper path. So then, for every euro that Greece overperforms the lower path, you give Greece €1 in face value debt relief. And you do that at the end of each year. So you start the scheme in 2023, which is when this post-program period ends. You run it for 15 years. And I mean, you will notice that because there isn't so much room between 1.5 and 2, right? So if Greece overperforms the upper path, they don't get anything extra because you don't want to give them incentives to like go crazy tight, right? So there isn't so much room between 1.5 and 2. So if Greece kind of overperforms the 1.5 and gets to the upper path over this 15 years, the most of face value debt relief, something like 10% of GDP. And what we show in the paper is that the combination of this relatively modest face value debt relief with the fact that they do hit the 2% for another 15 years, these two things are enough to make the debt sustainable. And that's what gives you this path. Now, in this path here, we are assuming, so this looks great, right? So here the GFN stays close to the lower bound of 15%. Here we are assuming that after this incentive scheme ends in 2037, they continue on the IMF's 1.5%. Now that may be too optimistic. So what if they go down to 1%? Then you get the right picture. So even if they go down to 1%, it's still okay, right? So this is something that we think would work, and I conclude. So the measures proposed by the Eurogroup will not make Greece's debt sustainable unless it maintains this unprecedented fiscal performance. There are two alternative approaches to restoring sustainability. You can either do this a much bigger maturity extension and interest deferral exercise, or you do conditional face value debt relief. And so our argument is that really the Eurogroup, the European creators, they should be choosing between these two approaches now. Why? Because if they wait, what's going to happen is Greece is going to start borrowing from the markets. And by the time that you then revisit the question of debt relief, there will be so much private sector debt outstanding that you would not be able to get away with just doing an OSI. So you may have a few years, assuming that markets borrow at low cost and that Greece really stays on the path of fiscal prudence from now to 2023, where you can change your mind. But very quickly after 2023, you will be basically in a trap, where it's either going to be, it will likely at that point be another OSI and PSI, unless the Eurogroup fiscal assumptions turn out to be true, which is they stay above the 2% for a very long time.
Thank you, Jeremy. Final presentation on the legal aspects of all of this, because obviously one of the objections to this face value reduction is that it's illegal. So we have Miguel Maduro who's going to say why that's not the case.
So being a lawyer, I made the point of not having slides, just to fit the stereotype. So I'm well aware that if you ask several lawyers about whether or not, in particularly, the proposal of face value debt relief is lawful under the treaties and under EU law, their immediate reaction is that it is not, by an automatic reading of what they call the no bailout clause of Article 125 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. If you then go and look, I mean, no one really argues in any detail on why that will be unlawful. And in fact, my view is that it is not unlawful. Any form of debt relief is a form of financial assistance, and that needs to be compatible with Article 125. Now, what Article 125 prohibits is for the Union or another member state to be liable or assume the commitments by other member states. The text of Article 125 regulates financial assistance, and this is crucial for the question of face value debt relief, within a triangle that comprises the initial creditor, the debtor state, and the debt-assuming state or institution. In this sense, it basically prohibits the transfer of repayment liability and the assumption of the debt commitments of another member state. The objective is simply and clear, is that of imposing market discipline on member states' budgetary policies and fiscal policies by not making their debt guaranteed by another state or by an EU institution. And this is what the entire focus of the Court of Justice in the judgment that really interprets Article 125, that is Pringle. To cite the court there, the court says, particularly in paragraph 135, the prohibition laid down in Article 125 ensures that the member states remain subject to the logic of the market when they enter into debt, since that ought to prompt them to maintain budgetary discipline. Compliance with such discipline contributes at union level to the attainment of a higher objective, namely maintaining the financial stability of the monetary union. So the court also makes a link between the need for member states to maintain budgetary discipline and a systemic interest on the part of the monetary union. The court then continues and says, given that this is the objective pursued by Article 125, it must be held that that provision prohibits the Union and the Member States from granting financial assistance as a result of which the incentive of the recipient Member State to conduct a sound budgetary policy is diminished. This means that for the Court, Article 125 is meant to impose sound budgetary policies on member states. Financial assistance is not excluded, therefore, so long as market discipline is preserved and or the incentives for upholding such sound budgetary policies are guaranteed. This is what the court makes clear in Pringle. Nothing in the treaty prohibits a member state for providing financial assistance to another member state. This is clear from Pringle. What is forbidden is for the provision of such financial assistance to take a form or the conditions that will undermine those sound budgetary policies. Now, the court also makes clear that the financial assistance needs to pursue and needs to be justified not only on the basis of solidarity between member states, but by the need to protect the systemic interests of the monetary union. But as that same judgment makes clear, and recent historians also, when a member state is in need of financial assistance, that by itself almost automatically imposes a systemic threat to the euro area. So it's a relatively easy condition to fulfill. What is also crucial is for whatever form of financial assistance and the incentives associated to that form of financial assistance to be constructed so as to guarantee and protect the goal of preserving sound budgetary policies on the part of the member states. The crucial criteria, therefore, is that the form, the type, and conditions attached to financial assistance have to comply with that fundamental objective of guaranteeing that the member state in question upholds sound budgetary policies. Now, even if member states, if the EU or the member states will be under an obligation, self-imposed or not, to assume the debt of another member state, that by definition will reduce the impact of market discipline and the guarantee of sound fiscal policies and budgetary policies on the part of the member state. That's why it is important, and Article 125 aims to pursue that, to guarantee the disciplining effect of debt markets by having variable interests imposed on member states. Now, this that explains why Article 125 is structured in terms of a trilateral relationship of preventing the debt of one member state to guaranteed by another member state or by a EU institution. Thus, a contrario, Article 125 does not rule out the possibility of debt forgiveness in the context of the bilateral relationship that emerges later among member states. In this instance, it will be the creditor forgiving the debt and not a third part assuming a liability for a member state's debt. What is crucial, I repeat, is whether the assumption of commitments is made a priori and with regard to other creditors. If it is, it becomes an implicit guarantee and therefore withdraws the market discipline that Article 125 requires. If it is not, then it is acceptable, so long as it is structured in a way that creates other incentives for sound budgetary policy. In this light, different forms of debt relief are possible so long as the means chosen do not endanger the purpose of market discipline enshrined in the treaty, and so long as they respect the conditionality requirement aimed at guaranteeing sound budgetary policies that the court also put forward in Pringle. Now, this does not mean that the form and the extent of debt relief is irrelevant, on the contrary. First, it is true that the more substantial the debt relief, the harder it becomes to demonstrate that conditionality-based financial aid represents a functional equivalent to market-based refinancing, according to the court's case law in Pringle. So debt relief, particularly face value debt release, it is true, may reduce government's incentives to consolidate budget policies. And that's why, in our proposal, it operates the other way around. Member state gets face value debt relief on how well, depending on how well it performs. That guarantees that even in the face of face value debt relief, there is in place a system of incentives that requires and upholds sound budgetary policies. Second, another possible limit that can be presented is that the ESM agreement limits the possible forms of debt relief, at least with respect to debt owned by the ESM. In fact, that agreement foresees recovery in full. But this, and this is an important point, is not required by Article 125. So it applies only to that debt, and even there could be an amendment on that agreement because Article 125 would authorize it. Third, one should not ignore that the more legally controversial the debt relief, the higher its political cost, and particularly because of the possible intervention and interpretation by national, constitutional and Supreme Courts, and how they will condition the respective national governments. As I said, even in the case of face value debt relief, I don't see any problem regarding 125, but I don't ignore the controversial character that may have for certain lawyers, and how that can then condition the political process in this respect. To sum up, what is important in light both of Article 125 and Pringle, in my view and in our view, to the extent that my economics colleague trusts on my legal analysis as I trust in their economic analysis, is for market discipline not to be eliminated and incentives for sound budgetary policy to be in place. This requires two things. First, financial assistance needs to be given in a way that does not eliminate market discipline. Second, when in the case of financial assistance it takes place and withdraws a state from the market, then such financial assistance must be given with forms of conditionality, and this is what the court requires in Pringle, that ensure sound budgetary policies during the period that the state will not be subject to market discipline. So long as these two conditions are respected, different forms of debt relief are possible, including the three that we propose, and including, naturally, in my view, face value debt relief.
Thank you very much. So I will, since this is by definition a very unbalanced panel, since I would say all three speakers agree on obviously the content of the paper, but that was the whole point of the presentation.
That was to be expected since the joint report.
Correct. I'm going to just play devil's advocate and raise just two small questions, and then we'll have room. So my first objection reading it is we've been talking a lot about how Greece needed more emphasis on structural reforms as opposed to fiscal targets. That was one of the criticisms, I think, which was heard throughout the crisis. And my impression is that your conditionality, however elegant, is purely on fiscal targets. So how does one ensure that Greece continues on this path of structural reforms that would guarantee boosting growth and ultimately getting out of this debt cycle? There is nothing, as far as I could tell, in your report which guarantees that. And the second objection, and the second question is actually a little bit broader, and is, are we sure that Greece is ready to leave the program as things stand? And I'm going to ask this question particularly in the context of the debate over the clean exit, which is something which Greece is pushing for, i.e. having no precautionary credit line from particularly the European Stability Mechanism. Wouldn't it be better if Greece took some sort of safety net as opposed to going into this wild world of financial markets at a moment, let's remember, when US interest rates are going up, there could be turbulence in emerging markets, Italy is a question mark. Yeah, wouldn't it be better to play it safer?
Maybe I'll take the first bit, the structural reforms question. And of course, you're perfectly right. Under our proposals, there are no constraints on the behavior of the government in structural reforms and maintaining, continuing, not reversing, indeed, the reforms that have been put in place. The question you have to ask, we simply didn't address that question. The question I think you have to ask, though, when you do address it, is whether after these 8 years of program discipline, of the Troika being in town all the time and telling ministers what to do and so on and so on and so on, whether that is sustainable going forward. The government, of course, as I said, wants to exit for strong political reasons, but I think you can make a good case that if they can't get ownership of those reforms going forward, then they're dead, right? We're dead. The debt is dead, whatever, okay? And it's that, I mean, my personal view aligns in this case with that of the government and not of the Bank of Greece, because I think that ownership by now is essential. How you do it, what we can do to help that, I think significant debt relief would be a positive factor in that regard. Chairman?
So to add to Richard, so Ferdinando, actually when we first met as a group, we for a while considered doing it differently, just doing everything about structural reform and why this sort of IMF-ish concern with, and in the end we we didn't do it for 3 reasons. First, as a pure matter of arithmetic, it turns out, or sort of we had this notion that basically the fiscal assumptions matter more for sustainability than the growth assumptions. So the growth assumptions are largely determined by demographics. And we, you know, I don't believe in a disastrous scenario where Greece just doesn't reform and doesn't catch up at all. I think we're talking about sort of, you know, maybe 10, 20 basis points of growth, right? It's a different order of magnitude, number one. Number two, obviously, you know, the whole trick about our conditional face value thing is that it's not very intrusive. So you just state an annual target and that's it. And then you show up once a year to see whether they have done it. With structural conditionality, you have to run a program, right? We don't need to do that, at least not in this program. And the final point, the most important one is, there's a far bigger conflict of interest on fiscal conditionality than on structural stuff, because it should be in the interest of the Greeks to you know, do reasonable structural policies, whereas it is clear that you know, Greece would not be running a fiscal surplus above 2% if it were not to repay its creditors. It's not in its interest, right? And so that's, in that sense, you need to condition on that. On staying in the program, spot on. I mean, I did not really present it very much, but we actually look at 3 ways to go, not just the 2 that I presented in the paper. One of them is this idea that maybe we can get out of the sustainability problem by never going back to the market at high rates, as long as the rates are high. So just continue with the program. And then we sort of played through the numbers. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work as a debt sustainability strategy, because even the program interest rates are projected to go up.
Yep.
And so, you know, you would have to keep Greece in a program for 3 decades, and even that might not work. So we sort of discarded it as a potential solution. However, with one really important caveat, I mean, my main point at the end, which maybe didn't come across, is that this notion that you can wait and see what happens, because after all, you know, the next stress crisis is probably 10 years or more away, is really wrong, because you're creating facts on the ground right now through private borrowing that you cannot reverse. A reasonable wait and see strategy, if you really wanted to do wait and see, what you would have to do is to continue financing Greece officially so they don't get into the adverse debt dynamics by borrowing it. So in that sense, you know, our recommendation is to the Eurogroup, okay, you should ideally commit to face value debt relief now. Commit now. You don't have to deliver it now, but you have to commit now and to explain to everyone how it's going to work. If you don't want to do that, the second best would be to say, okay, we're going to do our maturity extensions and we're going to keep financing Greece through official means for the time being to maintain the option of doing deeper debt relief in the future. That would be a reasonable way to go. But, you know, everyone is super keen on having Greece exit, including the Greeks themselves, and so we didn't play that up.
Can I just add one point on the structural reforms, because I remember that indeed when I first met in Athens, we discussed that a lot, and I was one of those that if we had found one way to do that, we'll be very happy. Because having been in a government that had to do the adjustment process, one of the things I noticed, and I remember, I think I said that in the group meeting, was that the entire program is very much focused on fiscal consolidation on the short term and doesn't really create incentives for structural reforms that may have more long-term effects. But the fact is that I think we really reached the conclusion it's very hard to develop that, and I'm already very happy that we develop a system of incentives that, in my view, provides the right political incentives. Really, by not giving the leeway first, but by rewarding sound budgetary policies adopted by a government. And moreover, with the second advantage, is that by linking that very clearly to the face value debt reliefs, for example, that makes clear to citizens the value of what their government did in terms of budgetary effort. This is a big, big advantage in political terms. It will be easy for a government that has done that effort to get some political credit from the citizens from that. And that's one of the huge difficulties that governments have to do the adjustment process is because it's not clear for citizens what they're gaining. Here we make it very clear for them. It's very easy to sign up political, and I think that's a big advantage of this innovative system of incentives.
Great. Okay. So I see a question there and then a question there. I think Could you say your name? And
George.
Sorry.
Maybe, George, you can say that you were the first one to...
Yes, George Papakonstantinou, first of a very long series of former Greek finance ministers. All right, I have two brief comments and three questions, also very brief. My first comment is this is an excellent paper. This is the best paper that I've seen dealing with the Greek debt, and I've read them all the DSAs. And I think part of what makes it so good is the idea of incentive compatibility that you build into the debt relief. My second comment is that this is a really depressing paper, because not only are there no good solutions, but the solutions that are reasonable that you're suggesting are so far away from where the discussion is at the moment. Which means that the most likely scenario is that we're going to simply delay, kick the can down the road. And the point you made, Jeremy, which is that you have a small window of opportunity to then be able to do it later is a crucial one. So my three questions. First of all, on the economics, there are two critical parameters, of course, the primary surplus and the long-term, the steady-state growth rate. Question on the primary surplus. Do you not think that the fact that Greece gets roughly 1% of GDP as inflows from the EU every year somehow makes the 2% more bearable? And second, you, like everybody else, stick to a steady-state growth rate which stops at 125 or something. And this is terrible. And my question is, where do you think, and I understand where it comes from, I've looked at the math also, and I looked at the TFP long-term estimates and labor participation, but we can't just accept that. And the question is, what would it be that could lift this steady-state growth rate, which would make a huge difference? That's my first question. Second question is, Miguel, in a legal sense, we all understand the difficulties of convincing the German Constitutional Court. What is the process? In other words, let's say that somebody bought this. Let's say that the Commission, in its infinite wisdom, decided this is the way to go, and it produced a blueprint based on this. Who would have to clear? Would this go directly through the European Court of Justice? Would it have to go from each? Because that may, if you're right, that may be a way to somehow say that this is indeed the case, that it is consistent, as opposed to having individual courts, such as the one in Germany, block it. And finally, and I'll stop here, does this analysis, we were discussing this a little bit before, does this analysis help the Greek case in the current conversation that they're having with institutions?
We're going to take that question as well, and then because we'll need to finish soon, so we'll just have the other question as well. If you could pass the mic. Then we'll have a final round of answers from our speakers.
Lukas Gutenberg from the Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin. One legal and one economic question. On the legal side, I have a lot of sympathy for your argument, but I'm afraid the finance ministry in Germany will have a different interpretation, and they will say Pringle was only about assistance via loans, but it didn't say anything about assistance via debt relief, which you just equate. I can see why, but one could also argue that debt relief is another form of assuming the liabilities of a member state. So I would be interested how you would give me arguments to convince the Germans on that. And then another question. This one is only about Greece, but of course Greece is only one part of the euro area. And I would be interested what you think more from the economic side, what that kind of solution, especially when it is about face value reduction, what that does to the whole EMU architecture, and how that sets a precedent for red debt restructuring in the future.
Okay. So if you divide these questions between the three, I would start with the legal, which is easier, and then you and Jeremy can.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, it's more straightforward who the respondent should be.
I think we have no expert for actually the hardest part of all, that is the political. So on the legal, How it is done, it's easy. You just do it. You don't have to pass by. I mean, that means that the people, the institutions that own the debt, or the member states, in the case it's state, will basically forgive the debt. And that's, now, where might the problems emerge? If, for example, you will have, in case of debt owned by the ESM, you will have to amend the agreement, then the German Constitutional Court might be called in to intervene. If it will be debt by a member that is owned by a member state, that might also be the case. In principle, even if the German Constitutional Court, in case of, for example, an amendment to the ESM treaty, and whether Germany will accept that or not will depend on the decision of the German Constitutional Court. So there are opportunities or the possibilities that the German Constitutional Court might be called in. Now, I don't exclude the possibility to convince the German Constitutional Court. There are good lawyers in Germany that I know that I think will accept the reasoning that I was following. And this leads me to the reasoning. And there was two parts in your question. One is Pringle. So Pringle is certainly not about face value debt relief, but it's about interpreting Article 125. And what I say is that the way Article 125 is interpreted generally in Pringle supports my reading of that provision as, under certain conditions, not prohibiting face value debt relief. And I think the most crucial thing, and it was always the difficult aspect for me to understand why some lawyers were saying it's that Article 125 is really about a trilateral relationship. And when you're talking about debt forgiveness, about face value debt relief, you're not in that context. And it's about a trilateral relationship because it's about maintaining market discipline. And that market discipline is actually put into question if you assume the liability for a debt of another state ex ante, and therefore some people know that there's no risk in buying that debt because it's also guaranteed by another state or by a EU institution. Once debt is owned by a particular creditor, and that creditor gives up on that has no impact on the market discipline in general. That's a decision of the creditor with respect to the debtor. I think that's the crucial aspect, and it, in my view, makes face value debt relief acceptable in Article 125. I actually think that is much more controversial legally. What, for example, the ECB is doing, with all respect, I have the Secretary General of the ECB in here, so I have to be careful. But it's more. I still think it's lawful. I think, and I agree with the decision of the European Court of Justice in that respect, in Goldweiler. But I think it's legally more controversial than this will be. I'm not saying it's politically easier, but I think legally is less controversial than some of the measures that have been taken so far.
I'm not sure that argument would fly in Germany, but...
Well, okay. 3 quick points. One, it was said that we all agree. Of course, we all agree. Well, yes, we do, but as Miguel said, it was after a long process of discussion, interchange, and it shows that economists, even when they start from different points, right, and a lawyer as well, that we can ultimately work out and resolve our differences and come to a common agreed set of proposals. And I think that in itself is significant from the point of view of understanding and interpreting this document. The second point on the growth rate assumption. I was, I guess, the one among us who was the least pessimistic, right? And I understand we put forward the arguments for 1 or at the extreme 1.25. I think one argument has been neglected, and that is that the demographic profile could change significantly if the outward migration were to reverse, as it did in the 1970s. It's quite interesting to me that the Turkish emigration of the 1970s turned out to be quite different from the Greek. The Greeks went back, the Turks did not. And I think there would be a reasonable prospect of getting so many of those very bright, very entrepreneurial people back into the country if the economic situation were to improve. And I think the overhang of debt is one obstacle to that. And finally, on the legal questions, I just have to ask, and maybe we settle this or discuss this afterwards. The question is whether the treaty, whether the TFEU overrides the ESM treaty in some sense, in any sense. That I don't understand. I mean, I have no idea.
Can I just answer this
Yeah.
one directly? Yes and no. No, yes in the sense that you can do in the ESM anything that Article 125 authorizes. So ESM can foresee the possibility or not exclude the possibility of face value debt relief, but can also prohibit it. And that's at the moment, because ESM foresees the recovery in full of the debt owned by ESM, it basically prohibits with respect to that debt. But if we change ESM, it's perfectly possible. Why? Because Article 125 is the higher law and allows that to take place. It's a relationship between a lower rule and a higher rule.
Great. All fantastic questions. So I'm actually going to take a crack at the legal question. So, Lucas, I have huge sympathies for the conceptual distinction between transfers and loans. And say, you know, loans, legal, because you get the money back, and transfers are not. However, I would be more convinced if Pringle had mentioned something about lending at market interest rates as being essential to the legality of the ESM. And as far as I know, they don't. And indeed, the ESM has turned it into an art form of obfuscating the boundaries between transfers and loans. And so, you know, if it is legal for the ESM to, you know, lend over 50, 60-year horizons at almost no interest rates, hence, you know, obviously leading to a present value transfer, clearly what we have in mind here, which is a relatively minor face value transfers, must be legal too. On what sort of... Yeah.
One point that I was forgetting. Actually, Gauweiler actually foresees the possibility, with regards to the ECB policy, actually foresees the possibility of the ECB incurring in losses. So that's an important element that adds to the...
Okay, you asked what kind of precedent does it set? It sets a message, which is stop bailing out insolvent countries because, you know, eventually the official sector is going to have to pay for that. And so, in my view, it strengthens the case for orderly debt restructuring and for doing things so we don't ever get back into this sort of situation that we had in Greece, which has been terrible both for Greece and for the credibility of the architecture. So it strengthens the case for reform. On George's really wonderful point. So I think this issue that the 2% is more bearable because of net budgetary transfers is a very good point, and I had never thought about it. So you could make that argument. I would say the following. I think we could not, however, sort of just subtract it, you know, from the typical thing that we see, because there are two things. It's about bearability, but more importantly, you know, the notion that you cannot sustain large primary surpluses over a long period is not so much about bearability, because you get yourself up there, you know, that's the hard part. And the sustaining is you know, what we're talking about here. It's about the political economy. And so here I don't really think it matters where the surplus comes from, how it is generated, whether some of it is in transfers or not. I think if you have a large surplus for a very long time, there will be pressures to spend it, particularly in a country that is relatively poor. That's why I sort of stand by. But I think it is an important point which we have missed. And then on this issue of raising growth, essentially I have the same type of answer, but so it is kind of depressed. I mean, it is hard to move these parameters, but there is a counterexample, which is Ireland. So if Greece can pull an Ireland, meaning you do three things at once, you really improve institutions, hence raising TFP. You have reverse migration because it becomes a hot place, everyone comes back, and also, you know, people migrate from other countries. And third, you have sustained inward FDI over a long period that just sort of mechanically raises the growth rate. This wouldn't show up in our potential necessarily. It's not really long term, but you can have like 10, 15 years period maybe of above potential growth, you know, 2-3% real growth, just like Ireland had. Something like that would work. So if you can have sort of a more beautiful, more cultured, more Mediterranean Ireland, that would be a great vision.
Well, thank you. I would ask you to join me in thanking the speakers. I would like, yes. And I would like to thank you as well, because this has been a very austere session. We haven't had any lunch, so, you know, I think it's, thanks for your, exactly, for your attention. And absolutely. So I hope you can find some lunch soon. And